What a difference a decade makes, or not. Nearly 10 years ago, Justin Trudeau jetted off to China, saying it was time to reject Stephen Harper's approach to the superpower and reset relations in view of a new trade deal. Those talks disintegrated. Now, Prime Minister Mark Carney is trying again on a reset. Take two. This time, not from Harper, but from Trudeau. How can we expect it to go, and what are the political stakes? Let's bring in our front bench to talk about that. With me tonight, former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant. He's now the CEO of Space Canada. Corey tonight was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former Director of Communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He's the co-founder and CEO of Rubicon Strategy. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is here, as is the Toronto Star's Queen's Park Bureau Chief Rob Benzie. Hi, everybody.
Hey,
Very good
Massey.
to see you. Benzie, I'll start with you because I thought it's so interesting that before the plane has even taken off, we have a bit of a controversy in those two Liberal MPs who were in Taiwan with this delegation alongside Conservative MPs, and they left early to come home because of the message it was sending China, essentially, that would, be contradictory in their eyes to the message that the Prime Minister is aiming to deliver when he goes. What does that tell you about how complicated this relationship is?
Well, it's hugely complicated, Vashti. And Helena Jasek and Marie-Francois Lalonde, whom I know because they both were MPPs at Queen's Park before they were federal members, were in Taiwan as part of a multi-party delegation. And the timing would have been really, really awkward for Prime Minister Mark Carney. And we know that sensitivities with China are always high, and it is a fraught relationship. And this is there's still the hangover of the two Michaels being held for almost 2 years and 9 months as pawns in a geopolitical game. So there are so many moving parts to this that I think it's probably wise for them not to be in Taiwan at this time, even though Canada's policy is that Taiwan is Taiwan, and we don't play games on Taiwan the way that some other countries might.
Corey, there's not just like that kind of political issue. There's also the political issue that's kind of not pitted provinces against each other, but certainly there are different interests in the country. The auto sector and EV tariffs up against canola and agricultural products. What kind of potential? Is there a potential resolve to that, or is that a further example of how complicated this is?
Well, it's really complicated, and I think China's being very savvy in the way that it's picked areas to tariff, to pit one region of the country against another on these things potentially. I think that's being very deliberate. And I think premiers have been very restrained in terms of their approach on this, in terms of not trying to divide the country against itself while the Prime Minister is trying to negotiate this stuff. Look, where this stuff lands, is going to be complicated. And I think the best thing for the government to do right now is probably to lower expectations pretty dramatically, because I don't think any of these things are going to be solved quickly. I don't think they're going to be solved on a first visit. I don't think they're going to be solved absent, a lot of other considerations, not just on China's side, but on our side too, as to who we want to trade with and what those relationships are going to look like going forward, especially given the position the United States is taking in a number of areas. There are things that we would probably like to do with China that the U.S. would react poorly to, and there are things that China would like us to do that would have the same reaction. So I think it's very complicated, and I don't think a lot of it's going to change quickly.
I'm not sure, and I'd love to get your perception, Tom, that there's a whole lot of expectation lowering going on. And that could probably be something we frequently say on a number of different subjects associated with the federal government right now. But even here, they're defining success. They're talking about how the tariffs are on the agenda. And even when we listen to those clips that our producers picked, it really struck me, because I remember covering that first trip in 2016, how high the expectations were set by then Prime Minister Trudeau on a quote-unquote reset. We almost need a drinking game for the word reset. In the same language is being employed 10 years later by this Prime Minister. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that Mark Carney doesn't want to lower expectations. He is talking the big game, and it's the justification for everything that they do. whether it's pushing aside environmental and other rules to get projects through quickly, running roughshod, at least in the perception of the First Nations, over First Nations, rights and Inuit and Métis people's rights. So because it's all an emergency, it's the emergency doctrine. It's from 100 years ago. Give me an emergency and then I can push anything through. I'll change the rules on government advertising because we're in an emergency. I think that the Canadian government is starting to realize the same thing Canadians have realized, that we've been extraordinarily good neighbors. We are the polite neighbor of the Americans. We've been in lockstep with them on big issues of foreign policy, of trade. Just over a year ago, just prior to Donald Trump winning his second election, we put ourselves in lockstep with the Americans for a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. What did that get us in return from the United States? It got us beaten up with tariffs and an intentional attack on our economy. Don't take my word for that. That's what Donald Trump said it was. He wasn't going to attack us militarily. He was going to attack us economically. Right now, Canada is working very hard, and Mark Carney has been very busy going around the world, shoring up markets, making sure the money was there for the big projects he's talking about, making sure we're getting new partners in our trade relationships, and China has to be part of that. Why, Vashi, should Canadian taxpayers be taking even more money out of their own pockets to give to the farmers who are being penalized by China because we put ourselves in lockstep with the Americans and get nothing in return? I think that that is actually on the table. I also think that there's a finite limit to our patience, and putting up with the remonstrations and the nonsense of Donald Trump over and over again, has got us nothing but grief, and it's about time we started acting on it and finding new partners with regard to what we used to talk about a lot in the past when we would visit China. Trudeau was hit with it, and prior to him, Paul Martin. Everybody who was going over was expected to talk about minority rights, Hong Kong. Not that they're not huge issues. There are people like Irwin Cotler, former justice minister, who's saying, don't forget, you've got to talk about these things. Carney is signaling clearly that he hasn't forgotten about them, but he ain't going to be talking about them publicly. He's a business partner. He's a pragmatist. He's going there to make a deal. And I think it'll be a failure if he comes back without some form of deal.
On that, they're saying, they're going to sign some officials today gave a briefing, Brian. They're going to sign some MOUs, but they're not even willing to say, for example, that a deal will be struck for sure on tariffs. In your view, politically speaking, what does the Prime Minister need to come back with in order for the trip to be characterized as a success?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, every time that there's meetings, there's premiers meetings, there's meetings with the prime minister and premiers, there's meeting with foreign leaders, there's the G7. What's going to be the outcome? I tend to think that people have seen this sort of movie before, and they recognize that it's not necessarily right then and there on the plane on the way back that they have all these sort of tidbits and tangible. This investment got done during this meeting. But I think in terms of all of the dynamics that my colleagues have talked about, Canadians are very focused on the economy. To Tom's point, I think Carney and the government kind of recognize that, and they feel that that's the priority, at least politically, if not on a substantive point of view. So I think that Tom's right to say that there's going to be a major focus on the economy, and I think for them to be able to point to success, going to what I believe a lot of Canadians are worried about at the moment, pointing to some type of movement there would probably be seen as successful. Being able to say we're going to continue the conversation on some of these thorny issues is probably, I think, acceptable. Look, they're setting the stage. The meeting itself, right, is they're trying to say is a success in the sense that it hasn't happened in 7-8 years, whatever it is. And then last but not least, I think to Corey's point, the timing. The only thing on politics that I will find very interesting in the months to come is, to Corey's point, I don't think they're going to have a free trade deal before the Kuzma review. And whether they go and they announce that a free trade agreement is in the works and they start to really sort of rev that up, is that helpful? Is it unhelpful with regards to the review with Kuzma? I actually don't know the answer to that. But certainly that has to be one of the major considerations this government has to undertake with their dealings with China moving forward.
Yeah, it would be, I think, surprising if they were able to see, Benzie, anything formal materialize. Like, even 10 years ago, prior to everything that's happened over the last 10 years, when Justin Trudeau was all in on a free trade agreement and saying the things you heard him say at the top of this segment, it was, things went sour well before Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were detained.
Exactly. And I think this is the thing that everyone has to remember and put it in context. I mean, this has been a very fraught relationship for decades. And Tiananmen Square in 1989, Brian Mulroney, the then prime minister, pulled back from China a bit because of the massacre of protesters in Beijing. So I think I understand what Carney is trying to do, and he's also doing this for reasons so that he can show Washington, say we can dance with other partners. We don't just have to dance with you. But I think Corey made a very good point about the domestic risks, Vashi. Premier Doug Ford here in Ontario is very concerned about removing those 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. They don't want Chinese EVs being dumped, which are subsidized by the government of China. They're artificially cheap, and that's why they're dominating the market in Europe, for example, among EVs. And there's a concern about our domestic EV market, and I understand that concern. And that's the one tariff that Doug Ford welcomes. When Justin Trudeau did that to match Joe Biden, the then U.S. president's 100% tariff, Ford was cheering him on.
Okay, I got to take a quick commercial break. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. That's okay. Go ahead.
I was just going to say there's a reason for that, and you touched on half of that, which is subsidization. The other half is theft of IP. China went to town in terms of inviting in companies like Tesla to learn how to make those EVs, ripped off the technology, and then are dumping them into our market. So it's it's the other half of the problem with China, which is the espionage and spying and IP theft.
Yeah, I think emblematic of the concern that we're turning from one problematic trading partner to the other, but perhaps, as everyone has talked about, out of necessity.